Good day to our dear viewers. Here in Children and Adolescent Literature, the significance of the literature for Filipinos, that the power of stories is undeniable. From the earliest age, children learn through narratives, developing crucial skills like empathy, critical thinking, and creativity.
For Filipino children, access to engaging and relevant literature is not just a privilege, it's a necessity. It's an investment in their future, equipping them with the tools they need to navigate a complex world and become informed and engaged citizens.
Now we start our discussion about the detailed timelines of Filipino children's literature from ancient to the present, based by the article of Profeta and Coa 1968. The timelines was about the pre-Spanish era before 1572 and to the Spanish era in 1572 to 1898 and to the post-Spanish era after 1898, and last is in the present day. Under pre-Spanish era was the oral tradition, Oriental influences, lack of dedicated children's literature, and the foundational in folkways. Also in nature worship, oral storytelling, chanting poems, and lastly, themes. Number 1 in the pre-Spanish era was the oral tradition. This era was dominated by oral storytelling, like stories, songs, epics, proverbs, and riddles were passed down through generation. And for example is the epic of the story of Biag ni Lamang, a famous epic from the Ilocano region telling the tale of a legendary hero. Number 2 was the Oriental influences. Filipino literature showed strong connections to the tradition of neighboring Asian countries. And for example is that the influence of Chinese literature. Filipino folktales often incorporate elements of Chinese folklore, such as the story of the Monkey King. And that the last in the pre-Spanish was the lack of dedicated children's literature, and there wasn't a separate category of literature specifically for children, because children learn from the same stories and literature as adults. And number 4, foundation in folkways. Ancient Filipino literature rooted itself in simple folkways, tradition, and human needs. And here in number 5, nature worship. Religious practices often involve tree worship, like the sun, the moon, the stars, and everything, and other form of nature worship to appease spirits. And number 6, the oral storytelling. When explanations we needed, people relied on story told and retold. Number 7 was the chanting poems. Poems were chanted, not sung, as was common in Asia. And the last one was the themes. Poems frequently addresses maxims, proverbs, epigrams, riddles, and advice, philosophy, story, gods, ancestors, wedding, harvesting, hauling rice, burial, war, love, and voting. The next era was the Spanish era in 1572 to 1898. And the events under it was the dominance of Spanish literature, the Povedano manuscripts in 1578, and Doctrina Christiana, and the influence of our dear Dr. Jose Rizal. Now we discuss the Spanish era in 1572 to 1898, and under it, number one event was the dominance of Spanish literature. Spanish colonization brought about a shift in the dominant language of education and literature. Filipino literature continued to exist but was mainly accessed by the masses, while the educated elite primarily read the Spanish book. And in the Povedano manuscript, 1578, was considered the earliest known written about the life, customs, and traditions of the ancient people of Negros. And example of this was the manuscript contains stories about the origins of Negros people, their belief, and their way of life. And next was the Doctrina Christiana in 1593, the first printed book in the Philippines focusing on the religious teaching. Example was catechism, prayers, and religious stories written in both Spanish and Tagalog. And next event was the influence of Jose Rizal. This era was Jose Rizal contributed to children's literature through his folktales and poems. And the example for it was the story of the monkey and the turtle. A fable written by Rizal teaches lessons of kindness and resourcefulness.
Let's discuss the key developments in Filipino children's literature during the post-Spanish era, focusing on the significant events and their impact on the growth and evolution of the genre. Number 1, the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris, incorrectly dated 1998. It was signed in 1898. This treaty made the Philippines a U.S. territory, causing a shift to English as the main language of education. Example, before the treaty, schools in the Philippines might have primarily used Tagalog or other local languages. After the treaty, English became the standard language taught in schools. Number 2, the rise of English literature. The introduction of English literature to the Philippines led to a significant increase in children's book and reading materials. Before this, the selection was likely more limited. The arrival of English language books broadened the range of available stories and learning resources for young readers. For example, English literature became widely available. Children's books might have been limited in number and variety. The introduction of English opened up access to a much larger selection of books from different authors and genres, enriching the reading experiences of children. Number 3, government support for English literature. The government's adoption of English as the language of instruction in schools played a significant role in promoting English literature. For example, before the government mandated English, many schools used local languages. After the change, English became the primary language for teaching all subjects, including literature, leading to a greater focus on English language books and authors in the curriculum. Number 4, a wide range of genres. Filipino authors started writing children's books even though English was the dominant language. This shows a growing effort to create literature that reflected Filipino culture and experiences for young readers. Number 5, the development of a national language. The Philippine government supported the creation of a national language, which eventually led to the publication of books in Filipino for elementary school students. This helped promote literacy and cultural identity. Number 6, Poetry for Children. Many Filipinos poets contributed to children's literature, writing poems specifically for young readers. Example, several well-known Filipino poets such as Angela Manalang, Gloria, and Aurelio S. Alvero wrote poems that were specifically designed to be enjoyed and understood by children, often using simpler language and themes relatable to young audiences. Number 7, Growth of Publishing. The children's book publishing industry experienced significant growth. Many new companies and organizations dedicated themselves to producing children's literature, leading to a wider variety of books available for young readers. Examples, before, only a few publishers offered children's books in the Philippines. But with the growth of the industry, many smaller independent publishers and even non-profit organizations began producing books, resulting in a much more diverse selection of titles for children. Lastly, post-World War II, year 1946. After World War II, in the year 1946, there was a renewed focus on developing Filipino literature. The war's end led to a resurgence of interest in creating and promoting literature that reflected Filipino culture and identity. Let's move on to the present day. Today, Filipino children's literature is modernizing, showcasing more Filipino authors, emphasizing good illustrations, and offering a wide variety of book types. There is also a growing number of authors and artists involved. Number 1, modernization of children's literature. Children's book got better. They started using more colorful pictures, better printing, and more modern ways of telling stories. Like example, old children's book might have only had black and white drawings and simple stories. Now, children's books are full of bright colors, detailed illustrations, and more interesting, engaging plots. The printing is also clearer and sharper. Number 2, emphasis of Filipino authors. More and more people appreciate reading books written by Filipino authors. There is a growing interest in supporting and celebrating Filipino writers and their stories. Example, before, most children's books were from other countries. Now, many people prefer to read books written by Filipinos because they want to support local authors and read stories that reflect their own culture. Number 3, the importance of illustrations. Illustrators play a key role in attracting children to books, creating a more engaging reading experience. Pictures in children's books are super important. They help get kids interested in reading and make the whole experience more fun. Example, color and interesting pictures make children want to pick up and read a book. Without good illustrations, a book might not be as appealing. Number 4, a wide range of genres. There are many different kinds of children's books now. You can find books about all sorts of things for kids of all ages and interests. Example, before, you might only find fairy tales or adventure stories for kids. But now, you can find children's books about science, histories, animals, sports, all kinds of topics. There are picture books for toddlers, chapter books for older children, and even graphic novels. Number 5, the space age and beyond. Children's books are now covering more topics like science, history, and geography. They're expanding beyond just simple stories to include educational and informative content. Like example, before, children's book might have focused mainly on fantasy or everyday life. Now, you can find books explaining the solar system, telling stories about historical events, or showing different countries and cultures through maps and illustrations. Number 6, growing numbers of authors and artists. More and more Filipino authors and illustrators are creating children's books. The number of people making these books is growing. Example, 10 years ago, there might have been only a few Filipino authors writing children's books. Now, there are many more, leading to a wider variety of stories and illustrations available for young readers. Lastly, number 7, the future of Filipino children's literature. As more Filipino children grow up reading, they continue to enjoy a wide variety of books and stories. This will help them love reading and appreciate their own culture even more. Like for example, because more Filipino children's books are being published and are readily available, future generations will have even greater access to stories that reflect their heritage and experiences, fostering a strong connection to their culture.
So we have more detailed timeline of the most important events in Filipino development of children's literature. We go in 1578, the Povedano manuscript and was known the earliest written work about the life, customs, and traditions of the ancient people of Negros is created. This document contains legends, myths, and tribal stories. So the Povedano manuscript record of the pre-colonial Filipino culture and storytelling traditions. It provides valuable insights into the beliefs, customs, and legends of the Negros people before Spanish colonization. And for example, is that the manuscript likely contains stories about the origins of the Negros people, their deities, their rituals, and their everyday life. And these stories were likely passed down orally generations before being documented in this manuscript, while the original manuscript is lost, and scholars have reconstructed its contents through various sources. And we go in 1593, the Doctrina Christiana. The first printed book in the Philippines is published. It focuses on religious teaching and is written in both Spanish and Tagalog. This book marks the beginning of printed literature in the Philippines. It was a crucial tool for spreading Christianity and introducing Spanish language and culture. Example is that the Doctrina Christiana contained teaching about the Catholicism, prayers, religious stories, and it was written in both Spanish and Tagalog, reflecting the early efforts to blend Spanish influence with existing Filipino tradition. Next, 1898, the Treaty of Paris ceded the Philippines to the United States, leading to a shift in the language of education and a gradual introduction of English literature for children. This treaty marked the start of a new era for Filipino literature, and while Spanish continued to be a major influence, the introduction of English education brought about a gradual shift towards English language books for children. Children's book by American authors like Beatrix Potter and Dr. Seuss became popular in the Philippines, introducing new storytelling styles and themes to Filipino children. And the happenings in 1916 was the revision of the Philippines educational curriculum, influenced by the passage of the Jones Law, encourages Filipino writers to create works for children and introduces the concept of developing a national language. So this was the revision of the educational curriculum, and the revision was encouraged the development of Filipino literature and national language, and it laid the groundwork for a more inclusive and cultural relevant education system. And the curriculum emphasizes the importance of Filipino language and culture, leading to the increased efforts by Filipino writers to create stories and poems for children in their native tongue. And the happenings in 1931, the Philippine government under the leadership of Manuel L. Quezon begins to support the development of a national language and encourages the writing of books in Filipino. This was the government support for a national language, and the President Quezon's leadership brought about strong push for a national language, paving the way for Filipino to become the primary language of education and literature. An example of this one was the government established the Institute of National Language, now the Commission on the Filipino Language, to standardize and promote Filipino. This led to the creation of textbooks and other educational materials in Filipino. And next, 1935, the Bureau of Public Schools take the lead in publishing books for primary grades in Filipino. This was the publication of books in Filipino for primary grades, and it marks a crucial step towards making Filipino literature accessible to children. And fourth, the Bureau of Public Schools published books for primary grades in Filipino, introducing young learners to stories and poems in their native tongue. And in 1938, the publication of the Pepe and Pilar series pioneering the use of Filipino in primary education. So the Pepe and Pilar series. This series of books written by Filipino authors was a pioneering effort to use Filipino language in primary education. It helped to solidify the use of Filipino as a viable language for children's literature. And the Pepe and Pilar series featured stories about the everyday lives of Filipino children using simple language and relatable themes. And in 1946, following World War II, there is renewed interest in developing Filipino literature. This was the renewed interest in Filipino literature, and following World War II, there was a strong desire to rebuild and strengthen Filipino culture. This led to a renewed focus on developing Filipino literature, including children's literature. And the Filipino writers, poets, and illustrators began creating more books for children and reflecting a growing awareness. So in 1950s, there is a growth in the publication of books for children with a focus on promoting Filipino authors and illustrating with colorful illustrations. This was the growth in children's book publication. The 1950s saw a significant increase in the publication of books for Filipino children. This period witnessed a focus on promoting Filipino authors and in using colorful illustrations to attract young readers. And for example of these books was Severino Reyes, Lola Basiang, and Francisco Blagtas continued to produce popular works for children. Illustrators like Cherry P. Gracio and Leo Abaya began to make their mark in the field. And in 1960s, the use of paperbacks becomes popular and publishers begin to focus on producing quality books for children literature. This was the rise of paperbacks and quality books. And this was the introduction of paperbacks made books for more affordable and accessible to wider audiences. Publishers began to focus on producing higher quality books for Filipino children with improved printing techniques and storytelling. And example was the use of color illustrations and more engaging narratives became more common in Filipino children's book. And now, in our present day, Filipino children's literature has evolved to become sophisticated and diverse, incorporating modern techniques and storytelling. Filipino authors are increasingly contributing to this field, and illustrators play a key role in attracting children to books. The future of Filipino children's literature looks bright with continued growth in number of books and authors, and a wider variety of genres, a greater appreciation for Filipino culture. And for now, it was sophistication and diversity in the present day. The significant role of the present day was Filipino children's literature has evolved to become more sophisticated and diverse. It encompasses a wider range of genres, caters to different age groups, and reflects to the changing world around Filipino children.
These timelines emphasize the key milestones in the development of Filipino children's literature, showcasing its rich history and its promising future. Thank you for listening.